John Stella maybe came the farthest of our speakers from New York, but John works, his research sites do include the Southwest, the Mediterranean Europe, regions of California, and the Adirondack Mountains of New York. He's associate professor of Forest and Natural Resources Management at State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, looking at riparian ecology, including dendroecology, plant ecohydrology, and restoration ecology. And it's great to see John again. Haven't seen him for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Darren and Nate and the committee for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. It's great also going right after Mark. I'm the other guy from Syracuse, but not Syracuse, Utah. And I'll be talking about restoring the West, but I'm going to think about it in terms of the global West. So I'll give you some examples from my research in California and in Mediterranean Europe. We'll be talking about challenges for riparian restoration on Mediterranean climate rivers. And I want to, right up front, acknowledge all the great collaborators that I have. Some of them in this room here on this work, and certainly what I'll be representing is not me alone. It's actually any faults in it are mine alone, and any benefits are due to these great folks, and also my funding sources. So my research, like many of you here, is motivated by this interaction between hydrology, geomorphology, and riparian vegetation. And the questions that motivate my work are how does riparian vegetation respond to physical drivers in river ecosystems, and then how can we use this knowledge to design tractable restoration strategies. So I'll be giving you a couple of examples from Mediterranean climate systems. Now, Mediterranean climate systems are characterized by distinct seasonality of precipitation and water supply. There's high seasonal variability in river discharge regimes, and there's a temporal asynchrony of when the water is available in the winter, the wet season, and when the plants need it during the growing season. As a result, the organisms are highly adapted to both disturbance and often also to stress, to drought stress during a long rainless summer. This drought stress imposes strong ecological filters, particularly on riparian organisms. Mediterranean systems also are characterized by a high human footprint. They're places where many people have established and lived, where there's large human population centers, often for hundreds or even thousands of years. What we see when we look at the riparian zones in Mediterranean climate systems is similar ecological pattern. Here's a system in Spain, in Portugal, in California. You can see the same kind of patterning of shrub vegetation, sort of mid-height canopy trees, and then a tall dominant canopy tree, usually a populous species in the riparian zone. These systems also are subject to very much the same types of human pressures, in particular high density of large dams, large amounts of water infrastructure to transport it, and also flood control infrastructure. In these riparian systems in Mediterranean climate regions, the populace-dominated riparian forest is a very important component of the ecosystem. They're hotspots of biodiversity and productivity. The remnant forest patches have high conservation value for agencies, NGOs, and other stakeholders. Establishment of new forest is highly dependent on the flood regime. And where there's dams and channelization, there's often reduced bank migration, reduced cutoffs, and reduced riparian forest creation. Here's a map from the Sacramento River with the red showing the populace-dominated stands along the river, both in abandoned point bars and along the active channel. Now, today I'll take you on a tale of two rivers, two that I've been working on for the last 7 years or so, the Sacramento River in California and the Rhône River in southeastern France. They have similar basin areas, roughly somewhere between 70 and 100,000 square kilometers. They're both long rivers, and they have a very high discharge. The Sacramento is the largest river in California. The Rhône is the second largest, draining to the Mediterranean Sea. They have human impacts that range from water impoundment and diversion, agricultural runoff and pollution, water diversion for navigation, for nuclear power cooling, and both are subject to climate change. There's a whole sort of web of federal and state and regional agencies that govern both the water infrastructure and the restoration options in these basins. And there's relevant statutes in California regarding flood protection that on the statewide level, plus the federal laws of Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act. In the Rhône, there's Europe-wide Water Framework Directive, which basically tells each European country that it must grade, basically rank and assess all of its surface water bodies, and those that are in bad condition, they need to upgrade them and put in restoration actions. Now, just talking about the management context for each of these systems, in California, as you know, there's been a whole host of state and federal water projects that have essentially replumbed the entire state from north to south with canals, dams, flood control infrastructure and pumps, and all this colored spaghetti or water projects that pump water, usually in most cases from the wet north to the dry south, where it's needed for agriculture and for the cities of Los Angeles and San Diego, with very large dams on the system and canals that pump water up and then gravity feed them down to the south. In the Central Valley of California, one of the most productive and lucrative agricultural economies in the world. There's about 1 million residents live, $70 billion in assets, and it's primarily agricultural with developed land cover in both row crops and orchards. The state-federal flood control system is about 1,500 miles of levees and structures, 200,000 acres of floodways, and 18,000 parcels. About 500 state and local agencies are responsible for administering this. And in a recent assessment, more than half of the levees are in poor shape and are either they don't meet design criteria or they're a high flood risk hazard. So it's a system that is, largely in need of repair, renovation, and updating. At the same time, it's kind of an ecological disaster. 95% of the riparian habitat has been lost, mostly to agricultural development in the floodplain. About 90% of the salmon spawning habitat has been cut off due to dams. There's a whole host of threatened and endangered species, including some that are very riparian dependent, such as bank swallows, cuckoos, pond turtles, beetles, salmonids. These are the poster children for a lot of the riparian restoration that's going on in this basin. In 2008, in response to some of these these concerns, the State Department of Water Resources instituted the state instituted the Central Valley Flood Protection Act, which is the response to it is being governed by the Department of Water Resources, and it does contain environmental objectives to improve natural processes and habitats where feasible. This has resulted in the first Central Valley Flood Protection Plan in 2012, and it's currently being updated for a 2017 version 2. Okay, in contrast, or in parallel, in France, the water resources have been developed with extensive dams, both stretching from the 19th century to the pre-war period for small dams, and after World War II for very large dams, mostly concentrated in the southeastern portion of France. And this is the Rhône River. This string of dams here it follows the course of the Rhône River. I'll show you that in a minute. The major operators are the French National Electric Company, EDF, and in the Rhône Basin, the Compagnie Nationale du Rhône, which is has basically a monopoly on the electrical power, hydropower generation in the Rhône Basin. In the Rhône itself, it's the lower Rhône from the Swiss border to the Mediterranean is about 550 river kilometers. There's been structural alterations that transformed the landscape and its inhabitants, starting in the 19th century with these river engineering works that channelized the river, narrowed it, and allowed it to deepen itself and form a navigable channel, so that freight traffic could reach the city of Lyon, which is inland, about 200 kilometers upstream from the Mediterranean. So after this channelization, in the 20th century, after World War II, there was a string of about 18 dams built along the river, primarily for hydropower, and this was a really important series of projects for rebuilding France and its economy following the destruction of the war. Currently, the Rhône Basin provides about 25% of France's hydropower. Since then, there's and the typical project, because the Rhône Valley has been inhabited for hundreds of years, and it would have flooding it would have required inundating ancient villages. That wasn't feasible. So there are these run-of-the-river parallel canals that essentially drop the river into low-head turbines, leaving the old Rhône, which you see this sinuous channel here, with only about 5% of the base flow. On the other hand, these low-flow channels also receive flood flows when there are very high periods. So it's an interesting mix of extremely low base flows, but occasional screaming floods that can sort of reset at least part of the system. Since the building of those dams, there's also been construction of nuclear power plants. Nuclear power is about 75% of France's power, and there's at least 4 of them along the Rhône that use large amounts of river water for cooling. So this was the landscape, the sort of infrastructure landscape leading up until about the year 2000. In 2002, 2003, there was a foundational event, which was a series of, or a 100-year flood that resulted in the flooding of Avignon and many cities downstream of Lyon. And this, combined with the ecological damage created by several centuries of intensive infrastructure, allowed people to start to think, okay, how can we reimagine the operation of the water infrastructure on the Rhône? What is sustainable river development in this context? And what new knowledge can inform the public debate? So in response to this, sort of analogous to the Central Valley Flood Protection Act, there was a Plan Rhône, which is a guiding document that governed the outlay of large amounts of money for restoration, for studying how to operate the infrastructure in a more sustainable way. So the first Plan Rhône, which went from 2007 to 2013, resulted in an outlay of about 600 million euro. The second one just started now, and is organized around 3 themes. Multifunctional environmental management, which includes flood risk management, resource quality, and biodiversity. Economic development, fluvial transport, freight is still a big, barge traffic is still a big component of the Rhône economy. Tourism and heritage valuation. The Rhône Valley is a very large and well-known wine region as one thing, and also a tourist destination, and energy production, along with a very strong commitment to integrating science and management. Okay, so there's the management context for the two rivers. I'm going to focus on the riparian zone on the Sacramento, which I said is the largest California river basin. Shasta Dam was built in 1942 and reduced the amount of channel migration downstream. However, there's about a 160-kilometer reach called the Middle Reach between Red Bluff and Colusa, which is still meandering, where natural processes still occur to a great extent compared to many other rivers in California. This reach has had a high interest by many stakeholders in terms of conservation and restoration, including the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Department of Water Resources. Now, on this reach, like I said, there are dynamic processes still occurring. So here's a paper we published looking at the connection or the requirement of channel abandonment for the establishment of large riparian forest stands. So here we have a channel that gets cut off. Here you see the cut-off channel. It terrestrializes, it fills with sand and silt, and these green polygons are cottonwood-dominated forests that establish on top of that. When we looked at it spatially, we found that more than 50% of the aerial extent of the riparian forest is associated with these abandoned channels. Another process is point bar migration, in which the channel erodes the cut bank and deposits sediment on the point bars, and new stands of pioneer forests established on top of that. We wanted to understand what governs or what's related to this process, and so we undertook a large forest inventory on point bars along the Sacramento to try to develop a chronosequence of forest dynamics with geomorphic evolution. Secondly, our goal was to project the forest trends into the future and the implications for management, and then to work with the agencies involved, like the Nature Conservancy, to develop tools, restoration tools, for governing how the forest would and how the river would be managed. We focused on 19 very large point bars along the river, and we used a stratified random approach to survey 430 plots, 500 meters squared, and we did a standard forest inventory looking at the overstory species that greater than 10 centimeters, understory plots for regeneration and herbaceous cover, and then we measured fine sediment depth. We stratified the plots by vegetation classes that had been mapped by the Nature Conservancy and a couple of universities, and we also benefited from a floodplain age map that was developed by Alex Vermeer and Steve Greco at UC Davis, to make sure that we were sampling from an appropriate chronosequence. So when we looked at the basal area of the species, the dominant riparian species, we found that plot whole basal area, which are these gray dots, really increased rapidly up to about 40 years and then leveled off and was amazingly consistent for about 110 years. Within that, though, the species were changing quite a bit. The first species to colonize and dominate were willows. That's these blue and green lines and this dotted line. And then Fremont cottonwood, which is the dominant in the system, they're the largest tree in the system, increased in basal area to about 30, 40 years, and then started to decline as some of the large trees died. In the understory, we found box elder and California walnut that increased their basal area and basically made up the difference in the senescent cottonwood stands. And then valley oak, which is the latest successional species, came in only after about 80 years. So this is our shifting species dominance. We also did an ordination and cluster analysis of the plots, and they broke out along 3 different types. One was dominated by cottonwood, that's the green. Another one by shrub sandbar willow. You can see what those plots look like down here. And then another one was kind of a catch-all for forest types that didn't really fit into those 2 categories. We did an NMS analysis to look at influences or correspondence with physical factors, and we found 2 interesting patterns. One was that there seemed to be a progression, a succession from willow to cottonwood to walnut oak that was associated with increasing elevation of the floodplain as it increased, in terms of sediment depth, and floodplain age. So as the plots were older, they went through this progression. However, there was a second axis that was represented by sandbar willow that was independent of age, but basically was an arrested succession in which the species composition didn't change over up to 70, 80 years. They stayed in shrub willow. There were different environmental correlates. The shrub willow plots were generally closer to the river. They had lower sediment depth than the forest plots. There were some geomorphic correlations with this. As we looked at their floodplain sequence, the fine sediment depth at any age was much less in the willow plots than in the cottonwood forest trajectories. And also the floodplain elevation occurred at a slower rate. When we looked at the fine sediment depth, there was not only differences between the forest groups, but there was also a very strong longitudinal gradient in which the sedimentation increased as you went downstream from Shasta Dam. And this may have indicated this may be due to increasing sediment sources downstream from the dam as fine sediment comes in from undammed tributaries. So in conclusion, in our Sacramento study, there were 2 forest development pathways, from a serial dominance from willow to cottonwood to walnut oak ash, and then an arrested succession from plots that remained in shrub willow for many decades. The sediment depth and the floodplain accretion were greater in the successional stands, and that begged the question, or asked the question, do high-energy environments favor shrub willows over trees? What's responsible for these patterns that we're seeing? In turn, there could be feedbacks in the system where the flexible and scour-tolerant willows may also facilitate lower sedimentation by laying down in high flow events or by shearing off and regenerating later. The decreased fine sediment depth upstream suggested a potential dam effect, a trapping effect of fine sediment with tributary inputs increasing downstream. But what was really clear was that the channel movement was critical for maintaining a diverse and productive riparian forest with a balanced age and size structure. So in current directions on the SAC, we're going to compare the forest dynamics pre and post Shasta Dam to see if we see a difference in terms of the successional pathways. And we want to couple the inventory to meander migration models to predict wood recruitment for aquatic habitat for sensitive species. This is a project we're just undertaking with the Nature Conservancy. We also took about 1,000 cottonwood cores, and we want to analyze growth rate sensitivity to climate change, which is also occurring in California. And we're going to work with the agencies to prioritize riparian management actions consistent with flood protection and the new Flood Protection Act. Okay, switching to our second system, the riparian forests along the old Rhône today look very similar to what they looked like 100 years ago. And part of the reason for that is the flood training walls that have trapped sediment and basically created old forests on top of the river that are cut off hydraulically from the river. If we want to look at the age and size structure of riparian trees, what we would expect, and this is data from Mike Scott and his collaborators, is that we would expect many small trees in the system and fewer and fewer large trees. And that would be like an inverse J-shaped curve for a size structure. What in fact we see on the Rhône is that for a couple of species, box elder, ash, we do see many small stems, but for the pioneers, they're very few. Few small trees, few willows and poplars, and most of them are older or larger. So we went into a study last year when I was on sabbatical in Lyon looking at what are the cumulative effects of human alterations on the riparian forest, and how can we better manage the system. So we undertook a riparian inventory similar to the Sacramento to look at pioneer tree regeneration, invasive species, and to understand and predict the future forest trends. We did a very similar inventory. We did 88 plots across 4 river sectors going downstream from Lyon. These are our 4 sectors here. This is a river training wall before forest has established as it's trapping sediment. This is what it looks like today. We did a similar stratification where we had pre-dam surfaces, post-dam surfaces, and older surfaces that predated the flood training walls. We put in similar circular plots. We monitored a bunch of different things, including size, composition, and fine sediment layer, fine sediment depth. We're just starting to tear into the results and understand the patterns, but in general, we're seeing that floristically, in the older forest, there's a lot higher shrub cover, a lot higher vine cover, and this is what the pre-dam forests look like versus the post-dam surfaces. We are also seeing, we haven't done a full size analysis, but the only regeneration that we're seeing is with box elder, which is an invasive non-native in this system, and common ash, which is a native post-pioneer. But the white poplar, black poplar, and white willow, there's almost no regeneration that we see in the system. So the question is, what are we going to do, or what are they going to do in terms of restoration strategies? Well, there's several strategies being considered, and it's not only for riparian restoration, but it's also for floodway conveyance and sediment delivery and reactivation of the floodplains, to manipulate water levels in dammed reaches of the river, to excavate floodplains to lower levels to encourage forest colonization, and then continual management and harvesting of vegetation strategically to maintain a diverse age structure. So the current directions for the Rhône work are to use the Sacramento chronosequence to evaluate the Rhône forest trajectory, and to work with the local agencies to prioritize riparian management actions to diversify forest age. We're also starting a project to model carbon stocks and evaluate carbon credits associated with river management approaches in the system. So looking at these 2 rivers and trying to put together some areas of convergence, there's a high interest in Mediterranean climate riparian systems, and we just published a paper in Hydrobiologia looking at these trends, and California and the Mediterranean basin have the highest number of studies recently, and I think a lot of that's related to the management context and the legal context. We need to better understand the impacts and predict forest trends, and to quantify the aquatic and terrestrial linkages, for example, with TES species. We also have to identify restoration reference systems across the regions. For example, how can we use the Sacramento chronosequence to identify restoration targets for the Rhône? And then in terms of the relevance of the Rhône example for restoring the West, and in this case, the global West, Western Europe and Western US, I think there's some really interesting lessons that we can learn about how they organize their scientific and management partnerships. There's a lot more centralized coordination with many scientific partner agencies and multiple financial sources, national, regional, and European. They have an impressive, in the Rhône Basin, a multidisciplinary science organized around large objectives rather than individual, say, threatened species. They're focusing on ecosystems and natural processes versus narrow legislative mandates, strong integration of biophysical and social science, and strong public outreach and engagement. There's an institution that is devoted to basically diffusing what's found to the public and bringing the public in via workshops, via all sorts of exchanges. Speaking of exchanges, we're just starting an exchange with the folks working in the Sacramento Basin, with folks working in the Rhône, and we're going to have a workshop organized around trying to understand commonalities in terms of science and management. That'll start in December, and then finally in June of next year, there'll be an IS Rivers, Integrated Science Rivers Conference that I encourage you to attend if you are so interested, that will look at these themes. Declarations of interest are October 30th and abstracts December 1st. It's in Lyon, France in late June. So with that, thanks for your attention. Okay, Mary says I have time for one question. Yes.
Given the longer duration or occupation of the Rhône area, is there any residual cultural use of the forest that may affect the past patterns that you're seeing?
So the question is, are there, given the cultural history of the Rhône, are there residual, is it residual weight? There is, the riparian zone is used in many places for poplar plantations. These are hybrid poplars, and so that is a land use that it has to be incorporated into whatever management plans are. But there's also abandoned poplar plantations that are sort of going back to wild. So yeah, but there's in some ways there's a lot less decision space on the Rhône in terms of the options, because it's so, you know, it's been so heavily managed. But there also seems to be a greater willingness for diverse parties to come together and make decisions about the management going forward. So it's a pretty interesting situation relative to what I see in California and elsewhere.